Thank you, Eli, very much. We'll now proceed to the opening session, and I'd like to have your patience for a few minutes before I invite our very honored guests to speak to us. This conference is the closing chapter of a 3-year series of faculty seminars on trust carried out by the Steinmetz Center and the Department of Philosophy, Tel Aviv University. It is also the opening activity for a planned series of seminars on the same topic by Israeli and Palestinian academicians. The lessons from this series will be submitted to leaders on both sides who will no doubt burst into tears of joy and gratitude and hurry to implement them on the ground. The results of such trust will include, the result of such series will include understanding of perceptions of trust by both parties, mapping the obstacles on the road to mutual trust, discussion of the ways to overcome those, and activity towards instilling the lessons in decision makers and publics on both sides, among other means, by a published volume. What separates this from other topic-sake conferences is the not so holy mixture of personal positions, scholarly theories, and practice. In the light of Indira Gandhi's words that you can't shake hands with clenched fist, we are of the conviction that shaking hands is a must, and we are determined to learn how to unclench our fists. Not less indicative of this position that values trust in the very participation of Mr. Ehud Olmert, a former Prime Minister of Israel. Trust is one of those soft, inverted commas, concepts whose influence is a function of context of their use along with justice, history, rights, and others. Unattended to, one of the parties to negotiations, usually the weaker one, experiences being deprived of a decisive argument as well as being put in a position of inferiority in the talks. The stronger party, on the other hand, brushes off the importance of those concepts, often suspecting that they only serve their interlocutors as a strategy. If, on the other hand, treated as a part of the negotiations agenda, the discussion might become subservient to immediate interests, which robs the discussion of its raison d'être. It also courts lengthy and insoluble differences, which tends to catapult the negotiations out of relevance. Therefore, there must be no avoidance of discussing trust, but this should only be done separately from the negotiations proper, independently of political events on the ground, as well as of timetable considerations and outside the public eye. Such negotiations can only be carried out in academic institutions such as this, the Steinmetz Center and the Abrams Center. The academia, being a treasure house of examined knowledge and subject to less immediate pressures than our decision makers, must not remain uninvolved, and we thus plan on taking such action. Arabs have always been convinced that Israel is out to expand to the entire Middle East, giving little credence to the official Israeli declarations to the opposite effect. Israelis, on the other hand, have put much credence in Arab declarations to the effect that their country and souls must be eliminated. But at the same time, they dismiss the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative as a dangerously clever trap to be trusted under no circumstances. During the 70s and the beginning of the 90s, a shift could be detected towards greater mutual trust, but unfortunately, it has given way to an ever-growing religious atmosphere in which, by divine decree, one is not to put trust in the other. Is it not once more the time to restore it? We are very proud of and grateful to the team of participants in this conference. They come from various scholarly and practical domains by order of appearance and domain. Political scientists, Shlomo Avineri, scholar and diplomat, Galia Golan, Yehudit Auerbuch, and Amal Jamal. Philosopher Asa Kasher. Social psychologists, Aryeh Nadler, Professor Dinka Biruski, Dan Zakai, sociologist, Professor Shtomka, Ramzi Suleiman, and a PR, experts on conflict, Mary Fitzduff, Dan Jacobson, Jewish philosophy, Shalom Rosenberg, Middle Eastern studies, Asher Sasser, persons of practice with academic involvement, Yossi Beilin, former Minister of Justice, Walid Salem, Ron Pundak. And last but not least, Mr. Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister, formerly the Prime Minister. Those opening remarks would remain wanting without thanking individuals in whose contribution to the preparations and the running of the conference is difficult to exaggerate. Yael Karni Alon, the studious, efficient, and good-spirited secretary of the Steinmetz Center. Ilan Shdema, the academic administrator of the conference. Ephraim Lavitz, director and leading expert in Palestinian-Israeli relations. Moti Tamarkin, the head of the center, who has done much to promote both the workshops and this conference. Dani Bartal for his invaluable contribution in thought, knowledge, and connections. And you, the audience, of course. Now, I would like to invite Professor Shlomo Avineri to speak to us.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers and especially Tel Aviv University for inviting me. I'm coming from the other place, and it shows that we can cooperate, and I hope with some trust. On the other hand, if you looked carefully at the title of my presentation, which is Between Trust, Mutual Interest and Verification, you might have noticed a little bit of a skepticism. And I want to share my skepticism with you after, I hope, being able to convince you that I think that trust is a good thing. I believe in conflict resolution. I'm on the side of the angels, so to speak. I am not sure, however, if wishing to arrive at conflict resolution, trust is the most important aspect. So perhaps I shouldn't have been the first speaker, certainly I shouldn't be the last speaker, and a lot of things which will happen in the next few days, which unfortunately I won't be able to attend because of other concerns, may probably be contradicting what I'll try to say today. I have two kinds of skepticism. One is a very general one and methodological, and the other one is more specific. The methodological one is the term trust, and we have heard Heidegger and Benjamin, and I'm glad to see Charlie Chaplin quoted in this context, comes from interpersonal relationships. And without going into the meaning or the significance of trust in interpersonal relationship, as a political scientist, I am always very skeptical when biological or psychological analogies are being brought into political issues, be they internal political issues, certainly when it comes to issues of international politics. Because certainly, when we talk about trust in interpersonal relationship, we know who the subject is. The subject is Ilai and I do have or do not have trust in each other. When we talk on the level of international relations, it's not so very clearly who is the subject. Are the subjects the negotiators? And it may very well be, and I think in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, there have been many cases in which the interlocutors, and you're going to meet some of them, be it former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert or Yossi Beilin, they had a lot of trust in their opposite numbers. But are they the subjects, or is the subject the state, an abstract institution, which is certainly not, doesn't have a soul and doesn't have a conscience or consciousness? Or is it the public? Are they public opinion polls which are the subjects? So I have a methodological problem, but I like just to mention it and leave it aside. My main argument will be trying to look at some examples, and they are very arbitrarily chosen by me, and other examples could also be chosen, and perhaps also counterexamples, where looking at attempts at conflict resolutions, some of them successful, some of them less successful, some of them total failures, and to see what were the ingredients both of success and of failure. Now, having in the 1990s spent quite a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia, I could have based my case on the post-Yugoslavian case. The present situation, since we have here people coming from this area, the present situation of a very close relationship between Serbia and Croatia, to my mind, and if I'm wrong, please contradict me, does not come because there is much more trust between Serbia and Croatia, or Serbs and Croats, but because after terrible wars, there are common interests. And there is a give and take, which may or may not bring more trust, but may, I hope, bring the entry of Serbia into the European Union, supported by Croatia, because it is in the interest of Croatia and of Serbia. The fact that the attempt to bring in Turkey into the European Union, which has now been stalled, but in the last steps, before it was really stalled, we could see that Greece was pushing very much the entry of Turkey into the European Union, and was really the spokesperson for Turkey and an advocate for Turkey. Was there more trust between Greece and Turkey at that moment? My guess is no. But Greek politicians, being able to overcome an ideological and religious and an historical lack of trust, not by replacing it by trust, because there is no trust between Greeks and Turks, both on the bilateral level, certainly not on issues like Cyprus, but because Greek politicians before the present crisis were able to reach a conclusion that it is in the interest of Greece to have Turkey inside the European Union, and perhaps in some way also being constrained by the fact that it's going to be a member of the European Union. Now, there may be other interpretations, but it seems to me that we can see both in the Croatian-Serbian case and in the Turkish-Greek case a very important development, which is positive, which has led in the Serbian-Croatian case to overcoming conflicts, and very deep conflict and very deep-seated conflict and historically burdened conflict, and also in the case of Greece and Turkey, and I could give other examples. But I'd like to take a much more wider case. And some of the things which I'm going to say are not going to be politically correct. I'm aware that what I have said already is not perhaps politically correct, but certainly some of the things which I'm going to say now are not going to be politically correct. I'd like to compare the end of World War I in Europe to the end of World War II. In both cases, there were victors and vanished. In both cases, a new order was set up in Europe. We can say globally, but basically in Europe. World War I was concluded by a series of treaties: Versailles, Trianon, Saint-Germain, if you wish also Sevres with the Ottoman Empire, but I'm not going to discuss it. World War II was concluded, if it ever was concluded, without any meaningful treaty in Europe. Now, this by itself suggests something about the importance of treaties and agreements. That you can have a situation where there is a plethora of treaties, as there was post-1918, and eventually those treaties were not worth the paper on which they were written. And you can find a situation of lack of treaties with a major world power confrontation with a nuclear threat at the back of it, which eventually brought about 50 or 60 years of stability and peace in Europe. So this as far as treaties are concerned. On the other hand, when you look carefully at what happened at the end of World War I, and we look carefully, Margaret Macmillan, I think, wrote the ultimate book on the Versailles Treaty. I'm not aware of similar books about Trianon or Saint-Germain-en-Laye. To those who need to record, Versailles was basically with the Allies with Germany, and Trianon was with Hungary, and Saint-Germain was with Austria. Now, when you look, and I'm following very much Margaret Macmillan's analysis, when you look at the Versailles Treaty, there are two things that stand out. And one of them, many people sometimes forget, that the Versailles Treaty was not a treaty negotiated by the victors with the vanished. The vanished, the defeated, were not at Versailles. In Versailles, it wasn't that England, Britain, and France, and the United States negotiated with Germany. They negotiated with each other. They did not negotiate with Germany. And the whole negotiations were among the Allies. And what you could see was a very paradoxical thing. That countries like England and France and Italy and United States, you can add Japan, but let's leave it out of the equation for the moment, countries that went together to war and fought one of the bloodiest wars certainly in modern times, and were ready both on the level of leaderships and mainly also the level of populations to kill and die for each other. So during the war, you could say there was a very deep level of trust between Britain and France. If you're ready to fight together against what? Okay. If you're ready to fight together against a common enemy, there must be some sort of trust among you, because otherwise, now there were disagreements, and we know that things were not easy, but there was a big... No, I shouldn't touch anything. And
okay. Someone to make sure that even if you touch, it's okay.
Okay, I trust you. So you have a situation where in the war there was perhaps the deepest existential trust, and also on the level of soldiers. British, French, American units were fighting next to each other and putting their life on the line. So it's almost the most existential kind of trust, not only among leaders who can disagree but still trust each other. When it came to Versailles, and they had to discuss the spoils of the war, Versailles was, of course, victors' conference, there was very little trust among them. When you look at what the way Lloyd George and Clemenceau, never mind Wilson, were talking to each other or talking about each other, and when we look at the minutes of the meetings, both the public meeting and the private meeting, you could see that people and leaders who were trusting each other existentially for 4 years were not trusting each other when it came to questions of borders, questions of reparations, etc. This is not the theme of this conference, but one of the reasons, obvious reasons for the failure of Versailles was that Versailles was not just a victors' conference. Usually when a war ends, the victors have more power than those who have lost the war. And those were always the cases of previous conferences. If you look at the 19th century, the Paris Conference after the Crimean War, the Berlin Conference after the Russian-Turkish War, 1856 and 1878, obviously those who won the war were in a better position. Versailles was unusual in the sense that those who lost the war were not at the conference. After the victors were able to agree among themselves in a situation with a lot of lack of trust on strategic issues, also on issues like the American Wilsonian philosophy, which didn't go hand in hand with a more European raison d'etat approach. Then the Germans were told, in an ultimatum, you have to sign on the dotted line or else the armistice is over, and obviously if the war starts again, Germany would have been occupied, not just defeated, but occupied. So I'm saying it with a heavy heart because one of the reasons I'm saying it with a heavy heart is that this structure of the Versailles Peace Conference was then one of the arguments used very, very successfully by Hitler, arguing that Versailles was imposed. Of course it was imposed. And the fact that this was Hitler's point leaves us sometimes forgetting that this was not only Hitler's point. This was a point of the German liberals, people like Rathenau. This was a point of the German Social Democrats like Ebert. And this is one of the reasons why when Hitler came to power and rescinded the Versailles Treaty and got out of the League of Nations, this was supported not only by Nazis and anti-Semites and racists, this was deeply accepted by most Germans who felt not that it was a diktat because they lost the war. Everybody knows if you lose a war, you lose the war. But you were not at the table. So you have a situation where the issue of trust is very, very complex. And you could see at one moment where there were certain interesting elements of interests coming up. And I want just very briefly to focus on one. One of the conditions put in Versailles to some of the new countries, or some of the old countries now being renewed in Eastern Europe and getting independence, like Poland, for example. Polish independence was one of the major achievements of World War I. People deprived of sovereignty and independence for 150 years because of raison d'etat between two empires was finally able to get its independence. But because of the elements of mainly human rights considerations and lobbying of a number of groups, all those new countries were, especially in the case of Poland, also Czechoslovakia of course, were coerced into signing an agreement on the protection of minorities. Carol Fink has written a very, very interesting book on this. And in the case of Poland, there was a very strong Jewish lobby, American Jews, mainly because in Poland, but also in other countries, there was a strong, large Jewish community. And the German lobby, which in 1918 was very, very weak. But after Poland was coerced into signing this as a condition of its independence, in the 1920s, you found a very unusual community of interest between three of the Polish minorities, three of the minorities in Poland, the Jewish minority, the German minority, and the Ukrainian minority, which was not very, very well organized, but it was still there. Poland, according to the conditions of the Treaty of Minority, had every year to report to the League of Nations about how it dealt with questions of not only individual freedom, but communal autonomy, issues of language, issues of schooling, issues of public space. And this did not help the Jewish or the German minority in Poland, because the Polish government at that time, especially those Polish governments in the 1920s which were headed by the Endecja, by the National Democratic Party, which was basically anti-German, anti-Russian and anti-Semitic, resented the fact that after Poland receiving independence, its independence was curtailed by people with the best kind of intentions, Wilsonian intentions, trying to protect minorities. It created a community of interest, not trust, but community of interest between the Jewish minority and the German minority in Poland. They didn't see eye to eye on many, many issues, and certainly there was not much trust. But there were common interests. So when you go through this, and you ask yourself what did work and what didn't work, the answer is much more complicated. And this is, I think, underlined by what happened after World War too. For obvious reasons, it was very difficult to find a common denominator after 1945 between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were almost on a head-on collision. Very little trust, which made it impossible to create a peace conference, not a la Versailles, but a little bit more better, in Europe after 1945. And until the 1990s, there was no peace treaty, formal peace treaty in Europe. And certainly there was no agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the three Western occupying powers in the Soviet Union. And those of us who remember Berlin, earlier Vienna, the third many if you wish, but Berlin in the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was eyeball to eyeball of two nuclear powers, with very little trust. Certainly the Americans didn't trust those communists and Bolsheviks, and certainly the Bolsheviks didn't trust the imperialist, capitalist Americans. I think the Cold War is an example where the trust between the two major powers was the least imaginable. I mean, and, calling it Cold War already suggests something, how far it almost came to a war situation. It did not come to a war situation. Not because of trust, but because of interest and because of the emergence, not a priori, but ex post facto, of very effective partial agreements, especially on issues like Berlin, between the three Western powers and the Soviet Union, basically between the United States and the Soviet Union, about modalities of coexistence and methods of verification. Everybody knew exactly who is moving not only nuclear rockets or anything like this, but who is moving jeeps or who is moving tanks or who is moving airplanes. The 1948 Soviet siege of Berlin was the utmost in a situation where a war could be triggered off, where everybody on both sides hated the other side, but realized that if you do something wrong, and if you use force, or if you appear as if you are using force, Armageddon may be around. So I think one can learn from it. Let me, because the conference is focused on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, or the Israeli-Arab issue, also make a few comments on this issue. And I'd like to take two examples. The Israeli-Egyptian Peace Treaty, Camp David, 1978, and the Oslo Agreement. And look at them from this complex coordinates of interest, trust, and verification. Now, Camp David, and anybody who was involved in negotiating knew that after the very dramatic visit of President Sadat to Israel, he's addressing the Knesset, something very, very dramatic and far-reaching. In the negotiations, both sides did not really trust each other. And because they did not trust each other, they put very specific and verifiable elements of verification, and at the end of the day, set up a mechanism, multinational forces and observers, which is not a United Nations force, because the United Nations voted against the Camp David Agreement, a great symbol of the contribution of the United Nations to peacemaking. There was a peace between Israel and Egypt, and the United Nations, for all kinds of reasons, voted against it. Today forgotten. Until this very day, you have in Sinai stations of the multi-force of observers, which are MFO, which are headed by the Americans, but it's a multinational force, and they are a trigger line group. They cannot enforce peace, but they are there. And because both sides did not trust each other to implement a very complex agreement, the fact that there was a multinational force which made sure that both sides complied. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, and we have seen its significance in the last 3 years, was able to survive not only 1 year of great Egyptian upheaval, but 1 year of an Egyptian government headed by the Muslim Brotherhood, which never accepted Israel, never was a statement by any leader of Egypt or of the Muslim Brotherhood that they accept Israel. But even under the Muslim Brotherhood presidency of President Mohammed Morsi, the peace treaty was implemented and was more or less kept. Not at the highest level, but it was kept. Because there was trust between the Muslim Brotherhood and the government of Benjamin Netanyahu? No. But because the Israeli interest was obvious, the Egyptian interest, even under Morsi government, was also obvious. The Egyptian government, with its agenda, whatever it was not interested in war or deterioration of the relationship. The Oslo agreements came out as an outcome between PLO and Israel with quite a lot of trust between the Israeli leadership of the Israeli negotiators and the Palestinian negotiators, and it fell apart, not because of the lack of trust. It fell apart because when the challenge came up of how to move from a tentative agreement, if you wish a ceasefire, to a final status agreement, the basic positions of both sides, and I think former Prime Minister Alon will tell you about it. I hope he'll tell you about it. I'm not sure he'll tell you about it, but I hope he'll tell you about it, that when he negotiated with the Palestinians, there was a lot of trust at that moment. I mean, Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen had in a way trusted each other because their interests appeared to be the same, but they were not able to agree on concrete interests, from settlements, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, etc. The issue at the moment, to my mind, despite the fact that obviously there's very little trust, when you look at the core issues of disagreement, they are basically substantive. Whatever you think about the issue whether the Palestinians should accept Israel as a Jewish state or not, the fact is this is a divisive issue. This is not an issue of trust. This is an issue of normative acceptance of the legitimacy of the other side. This is a very fundamental issue. Whether it should be conditio sine qua non, I think no, but it is not an issue of trust. Let me also add, and I have I think 2 more minutes, a case which is a very unusual case, and this is the Israeli-Jordanian case. For my sins, I have been present, not far from here, at a number of meetings in the 1970s, before public negotiations between Israel and Jordan, a number of meetings between King Hussein of Jordan and Prime Minister Rabin and Foreign Minister Alon and Defense Minister Peres at that time. And you could say that on the personal level, an element of personal trust and even personal liking was there. I think something similar might have happened also between Yossi Beilin and his interlocutors later on. But when you analyze why this sub rosa negotiations and cooperation on very sensitive issues, including common fight against what both sides called Palestinian terrorism, was not the trust between the two leaders or leaderships, but because there was a common interest. Both Israel at that time in the 1970s and Hussein after Black September 1970 viewed the PLO as an enemy and a deadly enemy, and therefore they could cooperate. And this cooperation created the trust, because it turned out that both sides were leveling with each other, both sides were trying to understand the interest of the other and pay along. And this is, to my mind, also the reason why now, despite the crisis in Israeli-Palestinian relationship, there is relatively good cooperation between Israeli army and security services and the Palestinian security services, not because they trust each other, but because they have common interest in keeping things under control. Yesterday was a good example which could have ended with a catastrophe. Last comment, and this very briefly. The series of negotiations started by Kissinger with the Soviet Union on the various START agreements and détente were not based on mutual trust. They were based on an agreement, on understanding of a weakened Soviet relationship, that it will be very dangerous for it to challenge the United States, because the United States is so much stronger, despite Vietnam and everything, and an understanding by people on the American right, Nixon, Kissinger, that the Soviet Union is weak, that the Soviet Union is not going to take over the world, there is no danger anymore of the communization of the world, but the Soviet Union is a very dangerous country, which can create problems, which then, in the third world, for example, which then can get out of hand, and therefore it would be in the interest of the United States to make certain concessions to the Soviet Union. So if I am skeptical, I'm skeptical not on normative levels. I'm skeptical not because I think that I do not think that trust is important, but if you want to move whoever it is, Serbs or Croats, Greeks and Turks, American and Soviets, Israelis and Palestinians, toward conflict resolution, you have to identify common interests. You have to move towards building more common interests, which then may create trust and also create mechanisms of verification, which both sides will not trust, but both sides will comply with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.